The rain came down in sheets, pounding against the freshly turned earth of the grave like an insistent fist. The funeral had been quiet, dignified, just as the man buried there had lived his life. Samuel Grayson was a respected figure in the small town of Blackwood, a retired history teacher, a devoted husband, and a man who never raised his voice or caused trouble. His death at 87 was mourned, but not questioned. After all, what secrets could such a gentle old man possibly take to the grave? But the storm that night had other plans. By midnight, the downpour had turned the cemetery into a swamp. Water pooled around Samuel's grave, loosening the soil until, with a quiet, groaning shift, the side of the grave collapsed. The coffin, sturdy oak though it was, tilted slightly, its edge exposed to the elements. And as the wind howled, something small and metallic slipped free from a hidden compartment in the coffin's lining, tumbling into the mud below. It was Hector Morales, the night watchman of Blackwood Cemetery, who found it. A weary man in his 50s, Hector had been making his rounds when his flashlight caught the glint of something half buried in the mud. At first he thought it was a piece of jewelry, maybe a locket dropped by a mourner, but when he wiped away the dirt, he realized it was a small, rusted metal box, its hinges stiff with age. Curiosity got the better of him. With numb fingers, Hector pried it open. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper, folded neatly but brittle with time. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. If you are reading this, then the truth has finally caught up with me. My name is not Samuel Grayson. I was once Private Daniel Carter of the 101st Airborne, a man who vanished from the records in 1944, presumed dead. But I didn't die. I ran. And what I did next, God forgive me, I cannot take it to my grave any longer. Hector's breath caught in his throat. The rain dripped from his cap onto the paper as his hands trembled. This wasn't just some old letter. This was a confession. And Samuel Grayson, whoever he really was, had buried it with him for a reason. Hector's heart pounded as he stared at the letter, the rain blurring the ink. He glanced around, half expecting someone to appear out of the storm, demanding answers. But the cemetery was empty, just the wind, the rain, and the ghosts of the past. He couldn't read the rest here. The downpour would destroy the fragile paper. Clutching the box tightly, Hector hurried back to his small office near the cemetery gates, his boots splashing through puddles. Inside, he locked the door, wiped his wet hands on his coat, and carefully unfolded the letter under the dim glow of his desk lamp. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste or fear. I was part of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. On June 6, 1944, I parachuted into Normandy with my unit. But something went wrong. Our plane was hit, and I landed miles off course, alone. In the chaos, I stumbled upon a farmhouse, occupied not by the enemy, but by a French family hiding an American officer, a captain. He was injured, barely conscious. He begged me to take a message back to Allied Command, a list of German positions coded in a small notebook. I took it, but I never delivered it. Hector's fingers tightened on the paper. This wasn't just a confession. It was a betrayal. I was scared, lost. I heard German patrols nearby. If they caught me with that intel, they'd torture me. So I buried the notebook, I left the captain behind, and when I finally found my way back to Allied lines, I lied. I said I had been separated, that I remembered nothing. They believed me, but the guilt never left. After the war, I couldn't go home. Not after what I'd done, so I became someone else. Samuel Grayson, a new name, a new life. But the past doesn't stay buried forever. The letter ended with a plea. Whoever finds this, tell them. Tell them Daniel Carter didn't die in the war. Tell them the truth about that captain. Maybe then I can finally rest. Hector sat back, his mind racing. Samuel Grayson? No. Daniel Carter had lived a lie for over 70 years, and now by some twist of fate, the storm had unearthed his secret. But what happened to that captain? Was he ever found? And where was the notebook now? Hector knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a dead man's secret. It was a mystery that demanded to be solved. Hector sat frozen in his chair, the weight of the letter pressing down on him like a physical force. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out as his mind raced. A missing soldier, a buried notebook, a betrayal that spanned decades. He had to tell someone. But who? The police? No, this wasn't a crime they handled. The military? Maybe. But how would he even begin to explain? Hey, so a dead man left a confession in his coffin. They'd think he was crazy. Then it hit him. Maggie, Margaret Maggie Lane, was the town librarian and the closest thing Blackwood had to a historian. If anyone could help unravel this, it was her. She had a sharp mind, a love for mysteries, and, most importantly, she was discreet. Hector grabbed his coat and shoved the letter and box into his inner pocket. The storm had eased slightly, but the night was still thick with rain as he hurried to his car. The drive to Maggie's cottage on the edge of town was short, but every second felt like an eternity. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. When he knocked on her door, it took a moment before the porch light flicked on. Maggie opened the door, her curly gray hair tied back in a loose bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She blinked in surprise. "Hector, it's past midnight. What's wrong?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the metal box from his pocket and held it out. Maggie's eyes narrowed. "What's this?" "You need to read it," Hector said, his voice low, "and then you need to tell me if I'm losing my mind." She stepped aside, letting him in. The warmth of her cottage wrapped around him as he followed her to the cluttered kitchen table, where stacks of books and papers fought for space. Maggie poured 2 cups of tea without a word, then sat down and opened the box. As she read, Hector watched her expression shift. Confusion, disbelief, then something darker. Understanding. When she finished, she set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. "My God," she whispered. "You believe it?" Hector asked. Maggie took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. Daniel, was always private, never talked about his past. But this makes a sick kind of sense. Hector leaned forward. "What do we do now?" Maggie's gaze sharpened. "First, we find out if that captain survived. And then," she tapped the letter, "we find that notebook." The rain had finally stopped by the time Hector and Maggie left her cottage. The early morning air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The streets of Blackwood were empty, the town still asleep under a heavy gray sky, as they made their way to the library in silence. Maggie's keys jingled in the quiet as she unlocked the side door, the hinges groaning as they stepped inside. The library was dark, the rows of books looming like silent witnesses as Maggie flipped on a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. She moved with purpose, heading straight for the back room where the town's archives were kept, old newspapers, census records, and wartime documents stuffed into filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. Hector hovered behind her, his arms crossed, his mind still reeling from the weight of the secret they now carried. Maggie pulled out a dusty box labeled 1940 to 1945 and set it on the table with a thud. If Daniel Carter, or Samuel, whatever we're calling him, was telling the truth, then there should be some record of a missing captain in Normandy around D-Day, she said, flipping open the brittle pages of an old military ledger. Hector watched as her fingers traced the faded names, her lips moving silently as she scanned line after line. The minutes stretched, the only sound the occasional rustle of paper and the distant creak of the old building settling. Then suddenly Maggie stiffened. "Here," she whispered, tapping a line near the bottom of a yellowed report. "Captain Elias Frost, 101st Airborne, listed MIA June 7, 1944. Last seen near Sainte Mère-Église." She looked up, her eyes wide. That's less than a day after the invasion. If Daniel was telling the truth, this is the man he left behind. Hector exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. So the captain was real. But what happened to him? Did he die there? Was he captured? Maggie shook her head, already flipping through another file. "I don't know. But if Daniel buried that notebook, it might still be there. And if it had coded German positions..." She trailed off, her expression darkening. "That kind of intel could have saved lives, changed battles." If he hid it instead of delivering it, she didn't finish the thought. Hector understood. This wasn't just guilt. This was a sin that might have cost lives. Maggie suddenly stood, determination hardening her features. We need to find out if Captain Frost's body was ever recovered. And if not, she met Hector's gaze. We need to go to France. Hector blinked. France, he echoed. Maggie, we're two small-town nobodies. We can't just... We have to, she interrupted. Daniel buried this secret for a reason. He couldn't live with it, and now it's ours. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight. That notebook could still be there, Hector. And if it is, it belongs to Frost's family, to history. We can't just leave it buried. Hector stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was madness. But the look in Maggie's eyes, fierce, unyielding, told him there was no turning back now. The storm had unearthed more than a box. It had unearthed a truth that refused to stay hidden. The idea of traveling to France felt impossible, yet within weeks it became reality. Maggie, with her relentless determination, had spent sleepless nights poring over maps, military records, and even reaching out to historical societies specializing in World War II. She discovered that Captain Elias Frost had indeed been declared missing in action. His body never recovered. His family, what little remained of them, had accepted long ago that he had died on foreign soil. But now, armed with Daniel Carter's confession, Maggie and Hector held a fragile thread of hope that they might finally uncover the truth. Hector had sold his late father's pocket watch to help fund the trip, a decision that weighed on him but felt necessary. Maggie, meanwhile, had convinced the local historical society to contribute funds under the guise of documenting Blackwood's veterans, though she carefully omitted the real reason. The lies piled up, small but heavy, and Hector often wondered if they were doing the right thing. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered the haunted look in Samuel Grayson's, no, Daniel Carter's, eyes in the only surviving wartime photo Maggie had dug up. A young man, barely more than a boy, staring into the camera like he already knew the guilt that would follow him for the rest of his life. The flight to France was long and uneasy. Hector, who had never left Blackwood, let alone the country, clutched the armrest during turbulence, while Maggie scribbled notes in a worn journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. When they landed in Paris, the bustling streets and foreign language made Hector's head spin, but Maggie navigated it all with surprising ease, her high school French just enough to get them by. They rented a car, packed with supplies, shovels, a metal detector borrowed from a friend, and a folded, weathered map of Normandy marked with the approximate location where Daniel had described bearing the notebook. The countryside was eerily beautiful, rolling green fields dotted with crumbling stone walls, and the occasional rusted tank left as a memorial. Sainte-Mère-Église, the nearest village to where Captain Frost had last been seen, was postcard perfect, its streets lined with flowers and its church famous for the paratrooper who had gotten stuck on its spire during the invasion. But Hector and Maggie didn't linger. They drove further out, following Daniel's vague directions to a long-abandoned farmhouse, now little more than a skeleton of charred wood and overgrown vines. "This is it," Maggie whispered as they stepped out of the car, the wind carrying the scent of earth and distant rain. Hector's hands trembled as he unfolded the map again, comparing it to the landscape. Daniel had written that he'd buried the notebook near a large oak tree, but the land had changed in 70 years. Trees had fallen, new ones had grown. The war had reshaped everything. Then Hector spotted it, a gnarled ancient oak, its trunk twisted but still standing proudly at the edge of what had once been the farm's boundary. Maggie saw it too, and without a word they grabbed their shovels and walked toward it, the weight of history pressing down on them. The digging was slow, the ground stubborn. Hours passed, their muscles aching, sweat dripping into the dirt. Just as Hector was about to suggest they'd gotten the wrong spot, his shovel struck something hard. Not a rock, something metallic. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the soil with his hands, his breath catching in his throat. There, buried for decades, was a rusted ammunition box. Maggie knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements, was a small, leather-bound notebook. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. Lists of numbers, coordinates, and, most chilling of all, a single name written on the inside cover in neat, precise handwriting. Captain Elias Frost. If found, deliver to Allied Command at once. Hector and Maggie exchanged a look. They had found it, the proof of Daniel's betrayal, the last words of a lost soldier. But as Maggie carefully turned the pages, something else slipped out. A photograph, black and white, showing a young Captain Frost smiling beside a woman and a little girl. On the back, a faded inscription, "To my darling Marie and Claire, I will come home to you." Hector's vision blurred. Frost hadn't just been a soldier. He'd been a husband, a father, a man who had trusted Daniel Carter to deliver his last hope. And now, decades too late, they were the ones holding it. The weight of the notebook in Maggie's hands felt heavier than lead. She traced the faded photograph with her thumb, the faces of Captain Frost's family staring back as if pleading across time. The air around them grew thick with unspoken grief, for the lives lost, the promises broken, the decades of silence. Hector wiped his dirt-streaked face with the back of his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Maggie didn't answer immediately. She carefully rewrapped the notebook in the oilcloth, her mind racing. They had proof now, proof of Daniel's cowardice, proof of Frost's fate. But what justice was there in exposing a dead man's sins? And what closure could it possibly bring to a family that had mourned and moved on? Then it hit her. "Claire," Maggie said suddenly, tapping the name on the photograph. "Frost's daughter. If she's still alive, she deserves to know." Hector frowned. "How?" "We don't even know her last name, or if she's still out there." "But we can find out," Maggie insisted, tucking the notebook and photo into her bag with reverence. "Military records, census data, there has to be a trail. Frost's family wouldn't have just vanished." The drive back to St. Mary Glees was quiet, both lost in thought. The village, so picturesque by daylight, now felt haunted by the ghosts of their discovery. They booked a room at a small inn, its walls lined with wartime memorabilia. Photos of soldiers, yellowed letters, rusted dog tags. The irony wasn't lost on Hector as he set their bags down. "Think the owner would mind if we borrowed his computer?" Maggie asked, eyeing the ancient desktop behind the front desk. The innkeeper, a grizzled old man with a prosthetic leg and a sharp gaze, didn't just let them use it. He helped. Turns out he was the son of a resistance fighter and had spent his life documenting stories like Frost's. Within hours, they had a lead. Marie Frost, the captain's widow, had remarried after the war and moved to Lyon. Claire, her daughter, had eventually settled in Paris. "She's alive," Maggie breathed, staring at the screen. "Claire Dumont. She's 78, but she's alive." Hector's chest tightened. "Do we just show up at her door and say, 'Hey, we found your dad's notebook after 70 years'? Maggie hesitated. "Number we call first, gently." The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice, soft but strong, answered. Maggie's French was clumsy, but the moment she said Elias Frost, the line went silent. Then in perfect English, Claire replied, "You'd better come over." The apartment in Paris was small but filled with light, the walls adorned with paintings of seascapes and a single-frame photo of a young Captain Frost in uniform. Claire Dumont, née Frost, sat across from them, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes the same piercing blue as her father's in the photograph. She hadn't cried when Maggie handed her the notebook. She hadn't even gasped. She just held it, her fingers trembling slightly as if touching a ghost. "All these years," she finally said, "I wondered if he suffered. If he was alone. Now I know." She looked up, her gaze sharp. "This Daniel Carter, he lived a full life? Was he happy?" Hector and Maggie exchanged glances. "He was respected," Hector said carefully, "but I don't think he was ever happy." Claire nodded slowly. "Good." A silence stretched, heavy but not unkind. Then with a deep breath, Claire opened the notebook to the first page and froze. There, tucked between the pages, was something none of them had noticed before. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in Captain Frost's handwriting. To Claire, to be read if found. Claire's breath hitched. For the first time since they'd arrived, tears welled in her eyes. "I was 4 when he left," she whispered. "I don't even remember his voice." Maggie reached out, squeezing her hand. "Now you will." Claire's hand shook as she carefully peeled open the envelope, the brittle paper crackling like dry leaves. The scent of aged ink and time-worn parchment drifted up as she unfolded the single sheet inside. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the traffic noise from the Parisian street below faded into silence. "My dearest Claire," she read aloud, her voice catching on the words her father had written nearly 80 years earlier. "If you're holding this, then the war is long over, and I did not make it home to you. Know that my last thoughts were of you and your mother, and that I loved you more than life itself." A tear splashed onto the paper. Maggie discreetly pressed a handkerchief into Claire's hand as the older woman continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've entrusted this notebook to a fellow soldier, a good man who promised to deliver it. The information inside may help shorten this terrible war. But more than that, I want you to have this truth. I fought not for glory, but for the world you would grow up in. Be proud, my darling. Be brave, and know that wherever I am watching over you." The letter was signed with a flourish. "Your loving father, Elias." Claire sat very still for a long moment, tracing the signature with her finger. When she finally looked up, her eyes held something unexpected. Not just grief, but relief. "He didn't abandon us," she whispered. "He believed help was coming." The irony hung heavy in the air. Daniel Carter had carried this letter for decades, knowing it contained the very absolution he could never grant himself. He had protected it, preserved it, perhaps as a form of penance. Maggie gently cleared her throat. "What will you do now?" Claire carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the notebook. "First, I'll call my son, his grandson, who's a historian at the Sorbonne. This belongs in a museum with the proper context." She paused, then added with quiet determination, "And then, I think I'd like to visit Blackwood, to see where Daniel Carter spent his life." Hector blinked in surprise. "After what he did?" Claire's smile was sad but wise. "He was just a scared boy, like so many were, and in the end, he made sure the truth came out." She patted the notebook. "This is my father's legacy, but Daniel's story is part of it too." As afternoon light streamed through the windows, the three of them sat together, bound by a secret that had waited 70 years to be told. Outside, Paris buzzed with life, unaware that in a quiet apartment, ghosts had finally been laid to rest. The rain in Blackwood had stopped the day they left for France. But now, as Hector and Maggie prepared to return home, they realized the storm had served its purpose. It had washed away the lies, revealing not just one man's guilt, but another's enduring love. And somewhere, perhaps, two soldiers, one who ran and one who stayed, had finally found their peace.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.